Shopify grows your business no matter how far or big you grow. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Whether you're selling your fans' next favorite shirt or an exclusive piece of podcast merch, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. Allbirds, Rothy's, Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. As this is an episode of our Vice Presidencies of the United States special series, I am joined by my co-host, Alex. Alex, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Very interested to hear how P-Funk continues his legacy and story since we ended it with part one.
Absolutely. And as we know from the last episode, that election of 1792 was kind of a pivotal one for him. And so in honor of that, we are having a little bourbon while we're recording.
Hear, hear.
And it is actually the 1792 small batch.
Yes, I think he would approve.
We're also going to come, as we go along, to a reason why we are recording it on this particular date. So, Alex, would you mind telling our listeners what date we are recording this on?
April 20th, 2024, or in some circles known as 420.
Yes. But there is a particular reason that is not related to 420, but is.
Okay.
But not.
But not.
Not that 420. Just as he's not that George Clinton.
Right.
So, we'll get to that as we go along. Just wanted to throw that little teaser out there. But before we really get going, Alex, what do you remember from part one of the George Clinton story?
Well, his was 6 consecutive terms?
Yes.
Of being governor. And I mean, my goodness. So he was in politics for about 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
He was in his mid-50s and failing health at the time when he finally, stepped back from the governorship. So having been in politics for that 30-year span, really through what most would consider the prime of his life, you're kind of wondering, well, how are you going to come back from that? So in terms of where he was when we started this journey and kind of where he is right now as we kind of continue the journey, I would say that he's made some really interesting choices. A solid leader, but he's definitely made a few mistakes along the way. Nothing from a malicious standpoint, from the best I can tell. So I'm very kind of curious to see what happens.
Yeah.
In 10 years from now, as we begin this, story of, it's 1795.
Yes. So we left off at 1795.
Right.
He decided to retire John Jay, who ran against him in 1792, and there was that disputed election.
Yes.
John Jay ended up succeeding him as governor.
Right. And so I believe he ascends to the vice presidency in 1805, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So that's 10 years. So it's just going to be interesting to see what happens in that 10-year span to get him out of retirement and hoist him into, more of a national role.
Absolutely.
Very, very interesting.
Absolutely. And a couple of other things just to make sure that we keep in mind as we're going along with this. So first of all, thinking of his start as a Revolutionary War general, he had that strong relationship with George Washington,
Yes.
which was really key to him being able to succeed not only militarily, but also in politics. That was a key friendship for him and relationship. Also thinking of kind of his ideology. So his ideology, he started out during the war, he was really for a stronger central government because he saw from the military standpoint, as well as during his tenure as governor, that they needed more direction. However, once the war ended and the Continental Congress was floundering, he decided we just need to look out for New York. So he had kind of a New York-centric point of view. But then also thinking of New York and his place in New York politics. So there were really kind of four key factions going in New York political circles. So we have the Clintonians, so the supporters of George Clinton. We have the Livingstons, who at this point, they're really kind of, I won't say junior partners. They're not as prominent, except in how they're aligning with other folks, but that could always shift. We have the Federalists, which was really Philip Schuyler, who was one of those early opponents of Clinton, but then also his son-in-law, a guy you may have heard of. He's, one of those people in history, Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah, I said before my namesake, and it's like, I'm not named after Alexander Hamilton, thank goodness. But wow, I mean, I'm sure everybody thinks of that, especially in recent context with Hamilton being so popular. But no, folks, I'm not named after Alexander Hamilton. I digress.
Yes. And then you started to see this guy pop up a little in the last episode. And we talked about him a good bit in his own episodes. Aaron Burr.
Burr in the saddle.
Burr in the saddle is kind of out there. He's doing his own thing. He's got his supporters. But as we go along in part 2, we're going to see him playing a larger role in New York politics and in national politics, because it's not really a spoiler since we've already covered him. He became vice president in 1801 before Clinton in 1805.
Greetings from Evergreen Podcasts. We're rolling out a listener survey and we want to hear from you. The information in the survey will help us gather statistics and in turn make our shows more appealing to advertisers. I know most people don't like ads, but this is one of the only ways our shows make money and help keep their lights on. We promise it will only take a few minutes, but the impact on our podcasts will be tremendous. As a token of our appreciation, we'll randomly select one lucky participant each month to win an exclusive merchandise package from Evergreen Podcasts. Head to evergreenpodcast.com/listenersurvey to help a show and possibly get some free stuff for doing so. We can't thank you enough for the support. Now back to the show.
So, let's pick up where we left off, which is George Clinton just retired. After 6 consecutive terms, he finally retired from the governorship. So during his last year in office, and we had mentioned that Edmond Charles Genet, who was the former French minister to the U.S., married his daughter Cornelia. So they moved to the Albany area to be closer to Cornelia's parents. Of course, George Clinton and his wife. But when they retired to their farm in Greenwich near Saratoga Springs, the Genets moved down to Jamaica on Long Island. Despite the distance, the Clintons were often either visiting their children or having their progeny visit them at their home in Greenwich. Once in retirement, Clinton found himself content to remain out of the public spotlight and even turned down a request from Democratic Republicans to allow his name to be put forward as the vice presidential candidate for the party in 1796. And we kind of cover that from Burr's point of view in his episodes.
Yeah.
Instead, Clinton focused on personal matters, including his real estate investments. His health even began to recover in retirement.
I was wondering about that. Okay.
Yeah, and that's the thing, we saw George Clinton doing so much, finally getting a chance to, take a step back and go a little slower, seems to have helped him.
Good.
Sadly, in late 1799, Clinton's wife Cornelia fell into ill health. As noted by Kaminsky, she, quote, suffered from fever and coughs and lingered for months, at times seeming to rally, only to take a bad turn once more. Finally, on March 15th, 1800, Cornelia Clinton died at the age of 55 at their home in Greenwich. After Cornelia's death, Clinton moved to Poughkeepsie. You've got to imagine that he was wondering kind of what was next.
Yeah. Retired from politics, and now his life partner's gone. So,
yeah.
Wow.
Opportunity was there because in 1800, Clinton was called back into public service by former Senator Aaron Burr, who was working to build up a solid Democratic-Republican electoral ticket to thwart Federalist efforts in the upcoming election that could also bolster Thomas Jefferson's chances at being elected president later in the year. So this is where we talked about in Burr's episode that he was pulling together that strong ticket because what was going to determine who won the electoral vote from New York was who won the state legislature in the elections earlier in the year. So Burr was able to arrange for this strong ticket to come up for Democratic Republicans to be able to take the state legislature and elect the electors who would in turn give the votes to Jefferson. But you remember I talked about those different factions. Mm-hmm. So the Clintonians and the Livingstons were both Democratic Republicans, but they had to be in alignment for this election for Burr's plans to work. So he knew he would have to build this slate of top-notch candidates. So, of course, George Clinton comes to mind, along with Horatio Gates and Judge Brockholst Livingston. Though he was initially reluctant due to his ill health and his wife's recent death, Clinton finally agreed to serve, and the ticket was duly elected by a margin of 500 votes. So close, but just enough to win.
Mm-hmm.
Clinton was also discussed as a vice presidential candidate once more, along with Robert R. Livingston of New York and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, who we'll be talking about in a future episode. But the Democratic-Republican nomination, as it was at the time, went to Burr, again discussed in his episode. Those involved in the decision-making process at the time noted that Clinton, quote, seems averse to public life and is desirous of retiring from all its cares and toils. Clinton himself remarked to someone sent out to feel him out on the matter that he was concerned about his age and health, as well as the fact that his wife's passing was still quite recent. He also expressed his concern of how it might look that he had been elected to the state assembly in order to choose Democratic-Republican electors for the state, and then to have those same electors in turn cast ballots for him as vice president. So we noted in Aaron Burr's episode, he had put together a slate of candidates before that had included him, but in 1800, he made sure his name was not on. This is why.
Okay.
Yeah. Clinton would conclude, when informed that the recommendation was being made for Burr to be the VP nominee, that he was, quote, the most suitable person and perhaps the only man for the job. So, at this point, he's in the state assembly. In 1801, with another gubernatorial election forthcoming, Democratic Republicans appealed to Clinton to run for re-election.
Oh, my goodness.
Here we go again. So, prior to this, Burr had been the favorite for the nomination, but he's in a higher post now. Mm-hmm. He's in the vice presidency.
Right.
They don't need him. The first approach to Clinton came in September 1800, and he initially refused. Thus, New York State Chief Justice John Lansing became the leading frontrunner until, quote, a caucus of Republican leaders approached Clinton about being the candidate on the condition that he could resign the office at any time he felt unable to serve. So basically they're saying, we know, we hear you, you're old, you're having health issues, you can exit at any time, we just need to run you right now. Please, for the love of God. And then, of course, you could see Lansing like in the back, hey, guys, what about me?
Yeah, right.
No.
I'm not Limburger Lansing over here.
Limburger Lansing, go.
That's right.
After some persuading from his up-and-coming nephew, DeWitt Clinton, George agreed to throw his hat in the ring once more and was duly announced as the faction's candidate on February 26th at the Adams Hotel in New York City. He would be challenged by Federalist candidate Stephen Van Rensselaer, the incumbent lieutenant governor. As noted by Lee, quote, while Van Rensselaer, around 40 years old, was described as too young and inexperienced for the job, Clinton was being criticized for being the richest man in the nation through his land dealings. So, interesting how they're trying to spin this election. This 40-year-old is too young. This guy's too rich. Overall, though, as described by Kaminsky, quote, the 1801 election campaign was mild compared with Clinton's two previous gubernatorial elections.
Okay.
Old attacks on Clinton, including charges of using his previous terms to enrich his personal finances, were brought back up, of course. Vice President Burr actually came out during the campaign to support Clinton, which Hamilton then attacked as untoward for the sitting vice president to insert himself into a state campaign.
Oh, good grief.
I know, right? Yeah, if it had been the shoe on the other foot.
You know.
Yeah. Sensing that the tide was turning in Clinton's favor, Hamilton attempted to provoke Clinton into a public debate with Van Rensselaer, to no avail. Clinton was like, no, I'm just going to sit here and look pretty.
Exactly. You could make yourself look like a fool.
Mm-hmm. Ultimately, Clinton would be reelected by a resounding majority of 4,000 votes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
As noted by Lee, this, quote, included a Republican victory in Manhattan for the first time.
Okay.
The carrying of the city vote marked a turning point in state politics.
I bet you Hamilton's biscuits were burning.
Ooh. They had already lost the election of 1800 in terms of the presidential election, and then 1801. He was not happy.
He wasn't happy at all. Making a fool of himself, and I'm sure it's coming.
With Hamilton, it's always coming.
Yeah.
President Jefferson sent his congratulations to Clinton on May 17th and commiserated with him on some of the challenges of being an executive, including appointments. Jefferson also opened up a line of communication with Clinton, who at one point had been critical of the new president, by asserting to Clinton that, quote, there is no one whose opinion would command with me greater respect than yours. If you would be so good as to advise me.
All right.
So, Jefferson really hoped to continue this Virginia-New York alliance that had helped the Democratic Republicans to claim victory in 1800. But since Burr, as we saw in his episode, was being seen as an unreliable partner, who better to align with than the now 7-term governor of New York? P. Funk. P. Funk is in the house again.
Mm-hmm.
As noted by Lee, quote, Clinton in his 7th term as governor met with modest success in having the legislature allocate funds for enlarging the militia and for additional fortifications around New York City. So these have been kind of themes that have gone through all of his terms as governor, preparedness for the state. So, of course, this is coming up again. However, unlike in his previous terms, Clinton didn't have as much control over appointments as the powers of the Council of Appointment had been enhanced. The governor's nephew, DeWitt Clinton, and DeWitt's brother-in-law, Ambrose Spencer, were the ones really running the show. As noted by Kaminsky, quote, their uncle, i.e. Governor Clinton, strongly disapproved of the ruthless way they exercised their authority in the Council of Appointment. The governor considered such blatantly partisan patronage as an abuse of power, and he protested on the council minutes, often refusing to sign the most obnoxious proceedings. So him and his family are kind of having some squabbles.
Yeah.
Still, as the term went on, the governor increasingly leaned on his nephew DeWitt for support, even when DeWitt temporarily went to Washington as a U.S. Senator before resigning that seat to return to become mayor of New York City in order to allow him to be closer to home to effectively manage political matters in New York. So we talked about some of that in Burr's episode,
right,
of course. While DeWitt focused his efforts on isolating Vice President Burr and eliminating him as a leader in New York politics, Governor Clinton worked to remain on good terms with Burr and did what he could in spite of his nephew's efforts to secure some appointments for Burr's supporters. Ultimately, though, there was no preventing the governor from being caught in the crossfire of this political feud. And when a pro-Burr pamphlet insinuated in 1803 that Clinton had called Jefferson, quote, an accommodating trimmer who would change with the times and bend to circumstances for the purposes of personal promotion, as well as other negative impressions, the governor was furious and denied the allegations. As Kaminsky wrote, quote, politicians in New York and Washington watched this dispute and wondered whether silence, lawsuits, or duels are to grow out of it. The governor chose the second route and filed, quote, suits against the author and the publisher, as well as writing a letter for publication in which he defended himself against the allegations. The governor also wrote to Jefferson about the pamphlet, sending him a copy and assuring the president that he had said nothing of the sort, which better to just go ahead and cut it off at the pass. Yeah. Here's what's going on. Jefferson replied at the end of the year that, quote,
the falsehood of that pamphlet gave me a test for the rest of the work, and considering it always useless to read lies, I threw it by. As to yourself, be assured no contradiction was necessary. The uniform tenor of a man's life furnishes better evidence of what he has said and done on any particular occasion than the word of an enemy, and of an enemy to who shows that he prefers the use of falsehoods which suit him to truths which do not.
In January 1804, Clinton wrote to President Jefferson about his plans for the upcoming gubernatorial election. Quote,
in this state we are, at present, able to effect any good thing we please to undertake, and as it is uncertain how long this may be the case, it will be wise in us to embrace this favorable juncture and fill the important office I now hold with some suitable character, not so far advanced in years, and enjoying a better share of health. Under this impression, it is my intention to decline a re-election. Prudential considerations, however, forbid publishing this determination at present. The partiality of my friends who overrate my services, and personal influence, will, I am apprehensive, be opposed to this measure. But as they must be sensible that my health, delicate at best, is impaired by the incessant care and confinement which the duties of this office impose on me, I flatter myself this will induce them to acquiesce.
Despite Clinton's professed desire to retire, President Jefferson, as well as other Democratic-Republican leaders, had started to think up other plans for the governor. With the 1804 presidential election coming up, and Burr being discredited as being continued as Jefferson's running mate, again, talked about all that in his episode, another candidate had to be chosen. Perhaps a popular governor from the Empire State to keep that Virginia-New York alliance alive?
Perhaps.
DeWitt Clinton, however, worried that his uncle's exit from the gubernatorial race in favor of the vice presidential campaign would mean that Aaron Burr would run to be his successor as the chief executive in New York State, and again, that happened. Prior to Clinton being chosen as the vice presidential nominee, DeWitt had tried to enlist Jefferson's help in convincing his uncle to seek another term as governor, but to no avail. Jefferson saw no need to interfere in state politics, which, again, saw in Burr's episode, and he needed a replacement for Burr in Washington. Beyond just the geographic advantage offered by Clinton joining the ticket, the fact that the governor would be 65 when he took office meant that he was likely not to pose a threat Secretary of State James Madison's chances of succeeding Jefferson as president. So you've got this guy who continues to say, I really don't want to run anymore. That's who you want as your VP candidate if you've already got your successor picked out.
He's kind of filling in the way Adams looked at the office.
Yeah.
Almost. Wow. Okay. A purgatory of sorts.
A purgatory of sorts. It seems that Governor Clinton himself was warm to the idea and may have had it in mind for a while, as in his recent term of office, he had been a vocal supporter of the Jefferson administration's policies, which was counter to his previous stance of largely staying out of national political debates. Finally, DeWitt followed his uncle's wishes and wrote a letter to Democratic-Republican leaders in Congress, informing them that the governor was willing to have his name be in consideration for the nomination. Thus, the Democratic-Republican caucus on February 25, 1804, decided upon Clinton as replacing Burr on the ticket by a vote of 67 to 20 votes for Senator John Breckinridge of Kentucky. 4 other candidates got votes, but again, from Burr's episode, Burr was not one of the 4. Upon learning of his nomination, Clinton wrote as follows, quote, I was in hopes that upon my relinquishment of the office I now hold, I would have been permitted to pass the remainder of my life in ease and retirement. But finding this to be inconsistent with the wishes of my friends, I shall consider it a duty to yield to their opinion. On February 13, 1805, the electoral votes were counted, and the Jefferson-Clinton ticket won with 162 votes versus 14 for the Federalist ticket of Charles Cotesworth Pinckney and Rufus King.
Wow, 14?
14.
Goodness.
The only states that the Federalists won were Connecticut, Delaware, and Maryland.
Okay.
Upon receiving confirmation of his win, the vice president-elect departed from New York City on February 19th, bound for Washington, D.C., where he took up residence at Stella's Hotel near the Capitol. On March 4th, 1805, Clinton took his oath of office, then witnessed Jefferson's second inauguration, listening to him deliver his inaugural address, quote, in the stuffy little Senate chamber. As was usual, it doesn't seem like the new vice president stayed long in Washington, as the next congressional session was not set to begin until December 2nd.
Goodness.
So as we've seen with other vice presidents in this series, Clinton was not present when Congress came into session, only arriving in Washington on December 11th and assuming his seat on the Senate rostrum on December 16th. The vice president was accompanied on his trip to Washington by his daughter Maria, and the two would stay with John Beckley, who was the clerk of the House of Representatives, the first librarian of Congress, and a key Jefferson supporter in the Capitol. Kaminsky writes that, quote, the 7 years that George Clinton served as vice president were not happy ones. Washington City was foreign to him. Indeed, as noted by L. Edward Purcell, Clinton, quote, had never been much inclined toward the pace of legislative deliberation, having avoided service as a delegate during most of his career in favor of the executive office, and he was apparently too old to learn either the substance or the subtleties of the Senate presiding officer's role. So, seems like a little bit of a misalignment.
Yes.
As noted by Lee, quote, it was in this confined setting of the Capitol that Clinton soon missed the active leadership he had exercised as governor for so many years. This lack of enthusiasm was in sharp contrast to the conduct of his predecessor, Aaron Burr, who had served in a term with more debatable issues. Burr took advantage of the close confines of the assemblage to expound at length on his ideas. Though Clinton had been brought onto the presidential ticket because he was not Burr, once he was actually in the office, the fact that he was not Burr, who had been a capable president of the Senate, became a hindrance rather than a helpful quality. It wasn't long before Senator John Quincy Adams, a man known for not parsing his words, wrote back to his father that, quote, Mr. Clinton is totally ignorant of all the most common forms of proceeding in the Senate, and yet, by the rules, he is to decide every question of order without debate and without appeal. His judgment is neither quick nor strong, so there is no more dependence upon the correctness of his determinations from his understanding than from his experience. Meanwhile, Senator William Plumer of New Hampshire described Clinton as follows, quote, he is an old, feeble man.
Ooh.
His voice is very weak and feeble.
Feeble.
I cannot hear the one half of what he says. He has a clumsy, awkward way of putting a question, preserves little or no order.
Dang. Let's just... Ooh. Okay.
Those senators were feisty.
They were feisty, and poor P-Funk getting beat up.
He's getting chewed out.
It's a little feeble twice, like back to back. Feeble. That's not good. That's not good. Okay.
This did not mean, however, that Clinton wouldn't have a role to play in his first session presiding over the Senate. So, as we've seen in past episodes, one of the most important roles of the vice president is to be the tie-breaking vote of the Senate, and Clinton would have two opportunities this session. First, the Senate had before it a bill to, quote, postpone the abolition of the slave trade until January 1808, which Clinton voted in favor of. So, again, this is something that we saw in the first part of his episode. Clinton was kind of more willing to allow slavery to continue. He wasn't really a strong supporter of slavery, but he also wasn't in too much of a hurry to abolish it. And in this case, it's the slave trade.
Mm-hmm.
Then, as we discussed in his seat at the table episode, President Jefferson had put forward a nomination of U.S. Minister to France John Armstrong Jr. to serve as a co-negotiator with Spain to try to obtain the Floridas for the U.S. But at this point, Armstrong was not popular in Washington. Thus, the Senate tied in the vote on his nomination. Again, showing his loyalty to Jefferson, it was Clinton's vote which confirmed Armstrong's nomination. Soon after casting the latter vote, the Vice President informed the Senate that he planned to leave Washington to return to his new home, a brick house on Casper's Kill in New York. As he wrote to his nephew DeWitt, quote, "My health is impairing for want of exercise." And thus, in March, he left D.C. to return to the Empire State. Unlike his predecessor, Vice President Clinton would have only a minor role in New York state politics. How much of this can be attributable to Clinton's choice versus the increasing prominence of his nephew DeWitt, even before Clinton became VP, is certainly a valid question. Without the former governor involved, however, the alliance between the Clintonians and the Livingstons collapsed soon after he took his oath of office as vice president. Now, in terms of his domestic arrangements while in Washington, as noted by Lee, Clinton, quote, would have one of his daughters accompany him by carriage or coach back to the capital. In Washington, where he preferred to reside in a boarding house, it was also to his liking not to enter into the social activities enjoyed by many of his associates. So he's just kind of staying at home. He's got one of his daughters there for companionship. Indeed, this would be the case when Clinton returned back to Washington, D.C. for the congressional session beginning on December 1st, 1806. The vice president and his daughter Maria would again stay with John Beckley. Sadly, Maria would soon fall ill, and as described by Clinton biographer E. Wilder Spalding, quote, "For many weeks, her condition was critical, and for a time, Clinton watched over her bedside day and night." It was so bad that at least one day during the session, February 16th, Clinton sent word that he could not preside over the Senate that day. And in a show of support, they adjourned for the day. So he is really concerned that he's about to lose his daughter.
Mm-hmm.
The vice president and his daughter were still staying with Beckley when he fell ill and passed away in April 1807.
Grief.
Unlike their host, Maria would eventually recover, though she was reported as still being, quote, ill and very weak as late as May. From the time of Beckley's passing on, Clinton stayed at different boarding houses during his trips to Washington to preside over the Senate. None of these lodgings would allow him the opportunity to do much entertaining, which Kaminsky notes, quote, did not endear him to society-conscious Washington. So this is the time that, Jefferson is holding his casual dinners, the Madisons are welcoming everybody to their table, and then you've got Clinton staying at home.
Yeah, not a good look, but
Don't really have room for it. No, don't come to my place. Nope. No, I'm not coming to yours either. When the Burr conspiracy came to light in 1806, the vice president wrote to his nephew DeWitt to urge him and other Clintonians back in New York to avoid association with Burr and his supporters. The Clintonians had briefly flirted with an alliance with the Burrites earlier in the year, which was quickly squashed when they faced such a backlash for just having dinner with some of Burr's lieutenants.
Agreed.
The VP wholeheartedly supported President Jefferson's efforts to shut down the conspiracy and prosecute Burr. Meanwhile, the Clintonians, as early as January 1807, began approaching the vice president about returning to New York to seek another term as governor.
Good grief.
They're wanting him back
You're not doing much in D.C. Come on back to the Empire State.
At this point, an 8th term.
Goodness gracious. You can't help but feel bad for him.
Yeah. I mean, at this point, and it's not even that he's seeking it out.
Yeah.
He's being used as kind of this political pawn at this point.
Yeah.
Okay, if Clinton's on the ticket, he's probably going to win, and we need a win.
Right.
But this was out of the question for Clinton. He may not have been overly excited about the vice presidency, but he also didn't want to go back and serve an 8th term. So instead, as the Clintonians had fallen out with his successor, Governor Morgan Lewis, The vice president used his influence to help convince Daniel D. Tompkins, a former Burrite, and, spoiler alert, someone that we will cover in a future episode of this series. Clinton helped convince Tompkins to run. Tompkins would win and assume office as the 4th governor of New York. So, if this helps us conceptualize just how long Clinton's career has been, Clinton was governor number 1.
Mm-hmm.
Because he served so many terms, there had only been John Jay during his one term, and then Morgan Lewis. That's it. And now Daniel Tompkins.
Mm.
So 1807 would also see a rupture in the previously warm relations between the president and vice president.
Knew it was coming.
We've seen it with every vice president thus far. They've had some kind of, either being distanced or just a complete breakdown.
Yeah.
As was the case with the previous VPs we've covered, though Clinton would offer his opinion to Jefferson on matters such as appointments and the issues of the day, that didn't necessarily mean that the president would follow his VP's advice. Indeed, it seems that Clinton was already a bit sore with Jefferson about appointments when the big disagreement came in the wake of the Chesapeake Leopard affair on June 22nd, 1807, which, again, kind of outside of our scope to go into too much detail, but in brief summation, the British Navy boarded a U.S. naval vessel off the coast of Virginia and took 4 sailors that they claimed were deserters from the British service. So this was an escalation of an already existing conflict about impressment. A few weeks later, taking his still ailing daughter Maria home to New York by sail rather than by land aboard a revenue cutter, Vice President Clinton witnessed firsthand British aggression as his ship was attacked by a British man of war. Now, as we've seen, Clinton had advocated for the proper defense of New York Harbor for years, and as he believed war with Britain was only a matter of time, especially after this incident, he's like, things are really getting bad.
Crazy.
He urged the president to take action in that respect. Jefferson, however, as we saw in his presidency series, opted to push for the embargo rather than military preparedness. This pushed the vice president over the edge.
Oh, goodness.
And he became a vocal critic of Jefferson. Now, he was not alone. Anti-administration forces in the Democratic-Republican faction had been growing in number for years, but the embargo really upped the ante. After 3 years in office, Senator William Plumer wrote again about the vice president. So this is the guy, the feeble.
Mm-hmm.
He again referred to him as, quote, old, feeble, and altogether incapable of the duty of presiding in the Senate. He has no mind, no intellect, no memory. He forgets the question, mistakes it, and not infrequently declares a vote before it's taken.
Good God.
And often forgets to do it after it is taken.
Oh.
Takes up new business while a question is pending.
Okay.
So 3 years in, he's not getting a good report card, at least from William Plumer.
William Plumer, man, sounds like I'm not gonna say what he sounds like, but geez.
However, in this assessment, Plumer did have at least some good words to say about Clinton.
Really?
Quote, "The more I see and know of this man, the more highly he rises in my estimation."
Oh, good. Couldn't go any lower.
There is something venerable in his appearance. There is that pleasing cheerfulness, that easy access, that flow of good humor, and docile manners that are so seldom found in men of his age, and which renders him, to me, a very interesting companion. He appears honest. He may not remember anything. He may be old as dirt.
Yeah.
And yeah, don't forget feeble. But he seems honest. He's interesting. Cheerful. Okay.
Like a good drunk uncle should.
Yeah, like a drunk
Happy
uncle.
Drunk uncle.
Happy drunk uncle presiding over the Senate.
Right.
Yep. Around this time, it seems that a number of Democratic Republicans were taking a second look at the vice president. Because as the 1808 presidential election approached, Jefferson had made it clear that he would follow Washington's example and not seek a third term of office. Thus, Democratic Republicans had to consider who would replace him. Now, it was the worst kept secret in Washington that 56-year-old Secretary of State James Madison was Jefferson's preference for his successor, but neither Madison nor the administration in general were viewed favorably by a growing number of Democratic Republicans at the time. And this also gets back to this whole idea of the Virginia dynasty. So we've had 3 presidents thus far, 2 were from Virginia, and you want to put up another Virginian. Some folks were kind of like, maybe we need to pick somebody else. But there's also another guy from Virginia who they were considering. These anti-administration folks really coalesced around 2 possible alternatives: the 68-year-old vice president and the 49-year-old James Monroe of Virginia. So I mention ages here deliberately, as Clinton's age, as intended when he was chosen as Jefferson's running mate in 1804, was an issue when it came to thinking of him as the top candidate in 1808.
Right.
Meanwhile, Monroe was talked up by his supporters as the young, fresh face in the race. It didn't hurt that he had fallen out with the Jefferson administration over his tenure as U.S. Minister to Britain, with the President and Secretary of State rejecting the treaty that he had negotiated with Britain alongside William Pinckney. Clinton's strength, as I said, lay in the fact that he was not from Virginia. So, with either Madison or Monroe, we would have yet another Virginian president. Some folks were like, we've had enough of Virginia for now. You sit down, let's pick somebody else from another state. Those advocating for Clinton's candidacy asked the valid question of why, you could keep the Virginia-New York alliance, but just switch it around to the New York-Virginia alliance. Jefferson did not help to quell the rebellion in the Democratic-Republican ranks, as he increasingly cut Clinton out of the decision-making process and, even worse, warmly welcomed former New York Governor Morgan Lewis to the Executive House, or, as it was derisively called by anti-administration folks, the quote-unquote palace. So, really to this point, Jefferson has steered clear of state politics, but he made a point of welcoming Morgan Lewis, who the Clintonians had fallen out with. Yeah. Meanwhile, Monroe's supporters, feeling that their candidate was falling behind, suggested a team-up with Clinton. They even proposed that Clinton could get the top seat on the ticket and Monroe could be his running mate. They're like, what do we need to do to make this anti-administration ticket happen? Ultimately, it was not to be. On January 23rd, despite around 60 not attending in protest, the Democratic-Republican Congressional Caucus chose Madison as the presidential nominee by an overwhelming majority. Meanwhile, Senators Wilson Carey Nicholas and William Branch Giles, both of Virginia, and both strong proponents of Madison's candidacy, decided that, in order to further undercut Clinton's chances at the top seat, they would put him forward as the vice presidential nominee again.
Oh, gosh.
Clinton would win this contest with 79 votes, over 5 votes for New Hampshire Governor John Langdon, 3 votes for Secretary of War Henry Dearborn, and 1 vote for JQA. Though he held his tongue in public, Clinton's displeasure at this result is best exemplified by the fact that he, quote, never formally accepted the vice presidential nomination.
Ooh,
yeah, he was not happy about this.
Well, it's weird, too. VP for 2 different presidents. I mean, has that ever happened before? Or has that happened since, should I say?
Yes.
Okay, very interesting. Talk about damaged goods.
So, to date, this has only happened twice in presidential history. Clinton is the first. The second is a guy named Calhoun.
Oh, John C. Calhoun.
Yes.
Got to come up with a nickname for him. I'm working on it.
You've got a little bit.
Yeah.
You got a little time. So he never accepted the nomination. He didn't reject it, but he just didn't say, yeah, I'm accepting. Senator Samuel Mitchell of New York, who had boycotted the caucus on the point of not wanting to be a part of what was expected to be a rubber stamp for Madison, visited Clinton the evening after the caucus and asserted that the vice president, quote, considered himself treated with great disrespect and cruelty by the gentlemen of his own party, who acted at the caucus. Mitchell, in writing to his wife, attributed Clinton's failure to make a better show at the presidential nomination by the fact that, quote, Madison gives dinners and makes generous displays to the members of Congress. Clinton lives snug at his lodgings and keeps aloof from such captivating exhibitions. The Secretary of State has a wife to aid his pretensions. The Vice President has nothing of female succor on his side. Besides, people object to Mr. Clinton, his advanced age, and his want of diplomatic knowledge and of the foreign relations of the country. Notwithstanding all his integrity, worth, and decision, I do not at present see how we can assure his election to the presidency. So this gets to a point, and we kind of discussed this when we were discussing Madison in his presidential series. Dolly Madison was key.
Yeah.
She made sure during Jefferson's second term to wine and dine folks in Washington, at Montpelier, to make sure to get that support. Meanwhile, Clinton's sitting in his boarding house doing his own thing. Washington didn't like that. He wasn't making friends. He needed that support if he was going to win the caucus.
But did he want to win the caucus?
Good question. Now, for his part, Clinton did not rely on Mitchell's support, writing to his nephew DeWitt in February that, quote, Mitchell's vanity and love of popularity, I fear, often leads him to give too favorable account of our prospects and measures, though actuated by no bad motive. Still, at this point, there was a chance that Clinton could be voted for by electors. As the presidential election was, by and large, not tied to popular votes, and indeed, 7 of the 17 states in contention did not have a popular vote for president, there was still a slim margin of hope, and some anti-administration leaders continued to push for an upset victory. On March 30th, 1808, a group of Democratic-Republican congressmen paid a visit to Clinton to clarify where he stood. The VP, quote, gave the committee a tart, severe, and puzzling reply, asserting that he didn't know, quote, what to do with their, i.e., the Democratic-Republicans, nomination of him, for he has not declined to serve his country when duty called upon. So this is one of those, and we have to wonder here, was he sincere, or was this just the, I really don't want it. I really don't want it. Give it to me. Give it to me. I really don't want it.
Yeah. Teasy McTeaserton Part 2.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Federalists even briefly considered the possibility of giving Clinton their endorsement as president, but would ultimately opt for Charles Cosworth Pinckney as their candidate once more. With the attacks on Clinton's age, his supporters countered with the valid question of, quote, if he was too old for the presidency, why then was he the caucus's near unanimous choice for vice president?
Good question.
Otherwise known as the guy who becomes president if something happens to the president.
Correct.
To the attacks on his inexperience with foreign relations, Clinton's supporters argued that Madison, who also had not traveled abroad or served in a diplomatic post, was just as inexperienced as the vice president and, as Secretary of State, had only served as, quote, the mere organ or mouthpiece of Mr. Jefferson in terms of the nation's diplomatic relations. Now, while these are some valid points, it didn't gain the VP much traction.
No. Or in any more alliances or friends or whatever you want to call it.
No. In late August 1808, Clinton expressed his distaste for the nation's capital to his son-in-law, Genet, calling Washington, quote, the sink of corruption.
The sink of corruption.
The sink of corruption. When the presidential electoral votes were cast, Clinton would only secure 6 from New York, which were given, quote, as a face-saving gesture for both Clinton and the legislature. Clinton would, however, win re-election as vice president with 113 electoral votes to 47 for Federalist nominee Rufus King and 3 votes respectively for James Madison, James Monroe, and John Langdon. Thus, as we talked about earlier, Clinton became the first of 2 vice presidents to serve under 2 different presidents. Again, as a sign of his displeasure of how things shook out in the election, Clinton did not attend the inaugural ceremonies in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
So this is the first time that we've seen a VP not come for the inauguration. Unlike Jefferson, who had, at least when he was assuming the vice presidency in 1797, considered constitutional implications for not being present in the nation's capital at the beginning of his term, Clinton didn't take his oath of office until he arrived in Washington for the beginning of the congressional session in mid-May.
Good grief.
I mean, he never accepted the nomination. He's not in any hurry to assume that new term.
Man. Which I'm sure did not sit well, in addition to everything else.
As noted by Spalding, quote, procrastination in taking the oath seems to have characterized the early history of the vice presidency. So we're really seeing this office as just being kind of an afterthought right now. Continuing to work on his personal finances, Clinton sold half of his estate in Greenwich Village in New York to John Jacob Astor, and the two, quote, entered into a partnership that called for laying out streets and neighborhoods and the sale of individual lots. The New York State Legislature, however, would delay them from advancing on this plan. Sadly, his daughter Cornelia, the wife of former French Minister Genet, passed away on March 23, 1810, in East Greenbush, New York. Her death was a large blow to the vice president, as they were so close.
Why did she die? How did she die?
I wasn't really able to find any details, but she was still fairly young at this point, so...
Good grief.
Yeah.
2 days before my birthday, too. Not good.
Yeah, so both of the Cornelius in his life, his wife and his daughter, are now gone. Still, Clinton did have one more important role to play in his tenure as vice president. In early 1811, Congress had to consider the matter of renewing the charter of the Bank of the United States, that institution that had been the brainchild of Clinton's fellow New Yorker and one-time friend, and more times than not enemy, Alexander Hamilton. Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin, despite being a Democratic Republican, was arguing in favor of a recharter. When the recharter bill came up for a vote in the Senate, it was tied, which meant
he had the tie-breaking vote.
Speaker of the House Henry Clay drafted the vice president's speech delivered upon casting his vote, but it should come as no surprise that Clinton, an avowed bank opponent for decades, and at this point a staunch opponent of the administration in power, voted against recharter. In his speech, Clinton asserted that, in his opinion, quote,
the power to create a corporation was not expressly granted by the Constitution and should not be assumed by implication.
If the bank proponents felt that the federal government should have such a power, quote,
the Constitution happily furnishes the means for remedying the evil by amendment.
He then concluded by stating that, quote,
in the course of a long life, I have found that government is not to be strengthened by an assumption of doubtful powers, but by a wise and energetic execution of those which are incontestable. The former never fails to produce suspicion and distrust, while the latter inspires respect and confidence.
Sadly for Clinton, this would be his last hurrah.
Yeah.
It was increasingly clear that Clinton was in poor health and would not be able to stand for a third term as vice president. First Lady Dolly Madison wrote in early 1812, quote, that electioneering for his, i.e. Clinton's office, goes on beyond description. After a bout of pneumonia, Vice President George Clinton passed away at O'Neill's boarding house at the age of 73 in Washington, D.C. on April 20th, 1812, attended by his daughter Maria, his nephew, Representative George Clinton, Jr. of New York, and his son-in-law, Representative Pierre Van Cortlandt, Jr., also of New York.
Was this a year after his daughter passed, or was this just like a month after his daughter passed?
So this was actually nearly 2 years.
Okay. Nearly 2 years after his daughter passed away.
Actually, no, just over 2 years.
Over 2 years. Gotcha.
Yeah. So this was just over 2 years after his daughter passed away. So we have our first vice president to die in office.
Poor P-Funk.
Poor P-Funk.
The P-Funk party finally stopped.
It did.
And it wasn't a party.
And it wasn't a party. After being elected as the president pro tempore, William H. Crawford, in officially announcing Clinton's death to the Senate, said the following, quote, by this afflictive dispensation of divine providence, the Senate is deprived of a president rendered dear to each of its members by the dignity and impartiality with which he has so long presided over their deliberations, and the nation bereaved of one of the brightest luminaries of its glorious revolution. A special joint session of Congress was held on April 21st to discuss the funeral arrangements for Clinton. That day, his remains were taken from the boarding house at 2 p.m. and laid in state at the Capitol building until 4 p.m., when they were escorted by President Madison, cabinet and congressional members, and members of Clinton's family for burial. As was published in the administration newspaper, the National Intelligencer, quote, "When a Clinton descends to the tomb of his ancestors, it is fit that the whole nation bewail the general loss, and history immortalizes his name. Hallowed be the ashes of the honored dead." Clinton was originally buried in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C., but in 1908, his remains were reinterred at the Old Dutch Churchyard in Kingston, New York, to be with those of his wife Cornelia. New York City marked his death with, quote, a day of public tribute on May 19th, in which, quote, a lengthy procession of public officials, militia, and private citizens marched from City Hall to the Presbyterian Church on Wall Street, arriving between noon and 1 o'clock. Prayers and music were followed by a eulogy. The bells of the city's churches tolled, and minute guns fired at the Battery and at Fort Columbus on Governor's Island. Shops closed and business was suspended as a bereaved city said farewell to one of its brightest and worthiest pillars and ornaments. With his death, and in particular his partnership with John Jacob Astor on establishing a subdivision of his estate in Greenwich Village, Clinton left, quote, his children and estate valued at about $250,000.
Man, that's balling back in the day.
Yes. Kaminsky, in kind of summarizing Clinton's career, asserts that, quote, to understand George Clinton, one must know the history of New York during his time. The man and the state were indissolubly linked for over 40 years. Elected governor of New York 7 times, Clinton was probably the most effective, most well-liked, and, after Patrick Henry, the most charismatic of the wartime governors. However, Kaminsky also notes that there have been misrepresentations of Clinton due to attacks on him by opponents like Alexander Hamilton, but that, quote, those who know more than the mere outline of New York's history during the Revolutionary era understand that there was more to George Clinton than the parochial anti-federalist who steadfastly opposed any increase of federal power that would come at New York's expense. Quote, George Clinton was a man who dealt with and understood solid, practical realities, whether on the farm or the battlefield, whether serving in the courtroom, the legislature, or as chief executive. He was eulogized as a practical statesman. In the immediate aftermath of his time, Clinton was remembered by the establishment of the George Clinton Society, but I wasn't able to find anything on how long this society actually lasted. Now, one part of his legacy that we must acknowledge is the difficulty in learning about him due to the fact that his papers did not survive to the present day. Again from Kaminsky, quote, most of his personal papers and many of his public papers were destroyed. First, when the British set fire to Kingston in October 1877, and later and more significantly, in the disastrous 1911 fire at the New York State Library in Albany.
Goodness.
But considering that we were able to get 2 episodes worth out of his life and career, we've still got quite a bit. But that, Alex, is the end of the life and career of George Clinton.
Poor P-Funk.
So, again, what day are we recording this on?
4/20/24.
The anniversary of his death.
Oh, wow.
He died on April 20th, 1812.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. So get your mind out of Cheech and Chong and put it in the...
in George Clinton. Not that George Clinton.
George Clinton. That's right. That's right. Wow. Poor P-Funk.
Poor P-Funk. All right, so Alex, now it is time to start ranking him.
Da, 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 da.
So, with this, we start with the resume round. This round looks at the overall career and character of the vice president, and we can award up to 10 points maximum each.
So the overall, including his governorship and everything.
Everything.
Okay, everything. 10 points each. Well, I'm going to say, because I mean, he was a strong governor.
Yeah.
And he really did have a pall over him as VP for both of the presidents, Jefferson and Madison. So 8.
8?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you look at his overall career.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a guy who's a Revolutionary War general. He was 7 times elected as governor of New York, although one of those is disputed. He was elected as VP twice under 2 separate presidents. Again, some dispute about the reasoning behind the second one, but, this was a guy who had a really good career and impactful.
Yeah.
He was impactful in New York State. New York politics at the time were dominated by him, and New York was one of the most prominent states at the time. He was able to use that to be an influence on the national stage, even though he wasn't in a national office. So, yeah, I mean, this is a guy who has a really good overall career. So, I think I'm going to go a little higher. I'm going to go 8.5.
8.5, okay. And the only reason I didn't go higher is because it seemed like, I know he had a lot of personal tragedy as VP, but he never really fully engaged with the role either, whether it was by his choice or not. It just, that's the only reason I didn't give him more points. I mean, I was really kind of thinking more of his governorship when I gave him the 8, but here we go.
Well, and we'll have a round coming up that we can talk about that.
Yeah.
But next up is the campaign poster.
All right.
So this round examines the physical appearance of the VP in their official portrait, and we can award up to 10 points maximum. So I'm going to bring up his official vice presidential portrait.
Okay, I hope he doesn't look feeble.
So you ready, Alex?
Let's take a gander.
And for our listeners, you'll see this on the cover art. Probably for the second episode, I'll have to find another one for part 1, but it'll be on the cover art.
Okay.
But Alex, here is George Clinton.
He does look a little feeble, but he's got a very strong looking profile, I guess.
Yeah. So kind of describe this portrait for folks.
Okay, so he's holding a paper. He's standing by an inkwell with a feather pen. I'm assuming he's overlooking some sort of, I don't know if that's a painting, but it looks like he's looking out from like columns over like mountains and water, whether that's the beach or a river or whatever. So it's rather regal looking.
And it's interesting because the ones that we've had up until now have been kind of plain backgrounds, and he's actually got an interesting background.
Yeah. The attire he's wearing, particularly the pants, are not particularly complimentary. He got a little bit of a pudge. But all said, I mean, I would say it's a decent looking, and comparatively speaking with the background, decent looking poster. So, yeah, okay. All right. Yeah.
So what are you thinking in terms of points?
Well, so how many points?
10 points up.
Points. I would probably say, let me see it one more time. Let's see P-Funk. He don't have a big party hat on, so just spoiler alert there.
So he's not getting the full 10.
And I guess just thinking about campaign posters from the modern context.
Well, and it's really just more about like this how he's looking in this portrait.
I'm going to go 7.5.
7.5?
Yeah, I'm going to go 7.5.
I'm going to give him...
It's very subjective. I mean, it's like...
Yeah. Well, and that's the point of this. I think that he does have kind of an appearance. It's not really... I won't say it's leadership, but more experience.
Yeah,
like you look at him and you see somebody... This guy's been through some stuff. He's
been around the block a few times.
He's been around the block. He's probably got some good stories. We can probably learn from him. I don't know that we necessarily look at this portrait and say, he's the one who we'd like to lead us.
That's exactly right.
I'm going to give him a 7.
Okay. So scored him a little higher this time. But yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking,
Yeah.
I got more sage wisdom and experience and less leadership from just looking at him.
Yeah.
On this.
And so with that, he's doing well thus far. He's got 31 points total. But now I think we've got some discussion here. And He may not have all those 31 points when we get done, because we are at our friend or foe round. This round evaluates whether the vice president supported the work of the administration or undercut the administration's efforts. So we can either award up to 10 points positive maximum for a friend or deduct up to 10 points negative maximum for a foe. So
this is going to be interesting.
First of all, we've got the fact that he served under two separate presidents.
Presidents.
And I think we can clearly state that with Madison, he's a foe.
He's a foe.
With Jefferson, it's not so clear, because for the majority of his first term, Jefferson's second term, Clinton was on Jefferson's side. And it was really when it came to the Chesapeake Leopard affair, things were getting bad with Britain. He's thinking about New York and we need defense.
Right.
And here Jefferson's just proposing this embargo,
which is kind of a weak stance. Yeah. I'm just going to say overall, and since he's in the unique position of being a VP for two different presidents, clearly foe to Madison, primarily friendly, but not quite so friendly towards the end to Jefferson. 1 point.
Positive or negative?
Positive. That's it. If it was just to Madison, obviously it would be in the negative. It'd be more than 1 point would be in the negative, but because of the combined.
Well, and I think that one thing to consider here as well, because we don't really specify that this is just during his term as vice president. When he assumed the governorship for the 7th term, he was really supporting Jefferson's stuff in New York State as well.
Good point. Yes.
He's definitely not going to rank high here. Yeah, I think I'm going to go with a 1. I think even when he was supporting Jefferson and, we think about, he was supporting him, during his first term as vice president, Jefferson's second as president, but was it really that strong of support? He cast the tie-breaking vote to push through his nominee, but other than that, I'm just trying to think if there's anything else that I'm missing that would show him as really contributing. Yeah, no, I think a 1 just sounds about right. All right. So with a 1 and a 1, that's 2 points in friend or foe. We decided he was a little more of a friend, but now we're going all negative.
Okay.
So this is our drag on the ticket round. This round discusses any disgraceful behavior of or actions committed by the vice president. And this disgrace does not have to be during their tenure of office as vice president. So this is going back to his entire career. Of course, it can count stuff as, during his vice presidency. And we can deduct up to 10 points maximum. So we really have a few things to discuss here. And let's go ahead and start with slavery. Was he an active proponent of slavery? No. Did he use not doing anything about slavery to his political advantage? Absolutely.
Yes.
And he did that, in numerous points in his career. He was willing to kick the can down the road in order to not rock the boat and make sure that he had support. So I think we've got to deduct some points there because it perpetuated an awful, heinous system in New York and really the nation much longer than it should have. We also have the fact that he ended up so wealthy at the end of his life. Those charges by his opponents that he had used his political office for his personal gain, he did. I mean, it's clear that he did. Now, was it, Gilded Age levels of corruption? No. He didn't drive the state into bankruptcy or anything else. It wasn't completely untoward. Also, we just got to say he wasn't the only one, and he is still, it continued on much past him, but he did use it for his own personal financial gain. So we do have to take that into account. Also, with his vice presidency, we decided that he was a little more on the friend side, but I think we also should take into account the things that he did against the administrations, particularly Madison's, and particularly with the Bank of the United States. So for somebody who had championed preparedness for his entire career to not realize, because at this point it was pretty well certain that the nation was going to war with Britain pretty soon. They struggled to fund the federal government during this time because of the absence of the bank. Clinton cast the vote to kill the bank. He's got to take some responsibility for that. There's got to be some accountability there, because it made the war effort much harder. It made it much more likely that Britain would win this war. So, Alex, what are you thinking?
I've been thinking about this, and I really think I'm going to have to go to a -6.
-6.
-6, yeah. The bank thing to me, that and slavery, it's more modern context. I know that at the time, there's that, but filling his coffers through his office, and the big thing for me was, the bank issue. Yeah, -6.
Yeah. And, just the fact that especially like towards the end of his career, it was like he was doing anything he could to oppose the administration, to the point of even allowing himself to be put forward as a presidential candidate when he had been, and it seemed like rightly so, saying, I don't really want to be in another office. It just seemed like he got this burr under his saddle. And he was deliberately doing anything he could to oppose him. So I don't want to go too high here, just because I think that there are so many folks. We've got some characters coming up ahead. So I don't want to go too high. I'm thinking a -4. And I think with our combined scores leading to a -10, that just seems like a good place for us to land.
Yeah.
So before we get to our bonus points, we've got one more round here, which is tenure of office. This is the entire time that the vice president served will be counted as points for this round. So Clinton served from March 4th, 1805 until April 20th, 1812. And so that gives him 7 points because he had just passed his 7-year anniversary as vice president. Mm-hmm. So now we get to the bonus points. A bonus point is awarded for each election that the vice president's home state went to the ticket when the VP was at the bottom of the ticket. And so even though technically he was also running for president in 1808, he was still on the ticket with Madison. We don't care if you didn't accept the nomination, you were still on the ticket.
Yeah.
So New York was won by the ticket in 1804 and 1808, so he gets 2 points here. We can award a bonus point if the VP served in another lower public office, either appointed or elected, after their tenure as vice president. He had no post-vice presidency. He was in the congressional cemetery, so he doesn't get that. He also does not get the bonus point if he served out his entire terms as vice president, so he did die in office, first one that we've had to date. And of course, he did not become president, even though he tried.
So what about the fact that he did serve out the first term of his VP?
So with this, I'm considering it like you actually leave office. So this is actually surviving the vice presidency. And he did not. He's one of those folks who did not survive the office. So with that, he did at least pick up 2 bonus points, which gives him a final total of 32 points.
So comparatively speaking, where he's at right now compared to our previous vice presidents, how is he doing?
He is right now in second place. John Adams is in first with 41. Clinton has 32. Thomas Jefferson ended up with 22. And Aaron Burr coming in last right now at 15 points.
Okay.
So, Alex, and points don't matter here. After all I've shared about George Clinton's life and career and what we've discussed, Do you think that this vice president is notable enough or impactful enough to preside from the Senate rostrum?
Even though he worked against the Madison presidency, given all of his accomplishments during his governorship and the fact that was very, supportive of the Jeffersonian presidency, at least for the most part, I would say yes.
So some folks may counter with, well, it doesn't sound like he really did a good job at presiding when he was VP. But I think, and this is one of those cases that his impact, I think most of the positive impact happened outside of the vice presidency, but it was still notable. And especially the defense of New York, it was key. And in particular, his defense of the forts, even though they ended up having to flee and the forts fell, it still delayed that British force long enough to keep them from linking up with the other force that was coming down. If that would have happened, the nation would have been split in two. So that was a key point.
So who was the guy who was calling him feeble, but then said he's also interesting? Because that's kind of, I got to admit, I'm kind of thinking of that when I assessed, whether he should preside from the Senate rostrum or not. So it's like, he's nice drunk uncle-ish. Doesn't really do a lot, but...
You're channeling your inner William Plumer. I'm going to agree with you. I think that he is notable enough and impactful enough. And even though it was a negative impact, the fact that he cast that tie-breaking vote for the Bank of the United States, his impact, for better or worse, would be felt for decades to come. So, congratulations, George Clinton. You are presiding from the Senate rostrum. So, thus far, out of our 4 folks, 3 have joined the VP Dream Team. We will see what happens when we get to our next Vice President, Elbridge Gerry. But before that, we're actually going to go on a bit of a tangent. So, I don't think I've shared this with you, Alex. Kind of kept it as a surprise. We are going to be talking about, in our next episode, William H. Crawford. I decided just to have some fun here because we have so many of these long periods, well, sometimes very long periods, that the vice presidency is vacant. Because basically what happens after George Clinton dies on April 20th, 1812, until March 4th, 1813, when the new vice president is inaugurated, they don't fill the position. The president pro tempore of the Senate presides over the Senate. And during this time, it is William H. Crawford. We mentioned him towards the end of the narrative of Clinton's life that he had, said these nice words to him and had been elected as president pro tempore. So in our next episode, we'll be exploring what exactly that office is, the president pro tem, and talk a little bit about Crawford. But spoiler alert, this is actually not going to be the biggest office that Crawford gets to, because he will have his own seat at the table episode. But we'll talk a little more about him and the office of President pro tempore next time. And then after that, we will launch into Elbridge Gerry, who, do you know anything about Elbridge Gerry, Alex?
Very, very, very little. I've heard you mention this and that, but nothing really standing out right now.
Well, and he's most notably named because his name is spelled Gerry, which sometimes folks say as Jerry, and gerrymandering. This is that guy.
Okay, right.
We've got a lot to talk about with Elbridge Gerry, but tune in next time for the president pro tempore-ship of William H. Crawford, and then come back for Elbridge Gerry. Alex, thank you so much for being here, for joining me for the series. I hope that P-Funk wasn't too much of a disappointment.
Again, I kind of feel bad for the guy. He had a lot of tragedy, especially in the latter part of his life. Didn't do himself any favors, but he, I think, had a pretty illustrious career before the vice presidency and even the first few years of it.
and we'll see what we think about Crawford and Gary when we join back together. But in the meantime, listeners, thank you so much for being here. We greatly appreciate you joining us for this journey through vice presidential history. If you want to check out some of the sources that we use for this episode, or if you have missed some of our past episodes of this series or any of the other series on presidencies, check out the website at presidenciespodcast.com. If you'd like to send any questions or comments our way, please feel free to email us at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. If you don't already follow us on social media, check us out on Facebook, Mastodon, and Blue Sky as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Again, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your support of this podcast. And until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.